I was absolutely certain I was alone. The kind of certain that sits in your bones. A quiet knowledge of solitude in a still house. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen downstairs and the occasional sigh of the old oak tree brushing against the windowpane. I had checked the locks 3 times, a ritual born not from paranoia, but from the simple, comforting geometry of urban living. Deadbolt, chain, knob, all secured. My world was a small, safe capsule of lamplight and worn pages. As I settled deeper into the armchair, a book resting in my lap. Then it came. Not a crash, not a bang. Nothing so vulgar. It was a whisper, a breath of sound that shouldn't have existed in the sealed silence. It slid through the air, too clear to be the house settling, too close to be from the street. It was a voice, frayed and soft, like rustling parchment, and it whispered my name. Not a shouted alarm, but a familiar, intimate utterance, as if someone stood just behind my shoulder, their lips nearly touching my ear. The air didn't grow cold. The lights didn't flicker. There was no spectral figure. Just that sound, a violation of physics and probability. In that instant, the solid foundation of my understanding cracked. If I could be so wrong about being alone, what else was I wrong about? What other quiet, impossible truths were waiting in the corners of the world, in the locked rooms of seemingly ordinary lives? This is not a collection of campfire tales or digital age folklore. This is a gathering of echoes, the lingering tremors from moments when reality itself seemed to stutter. These are accounts from the past year, shared by people who contacted us, not for fame, but for a desperate shared validation. They need to know that someone else hears the tremor in their voice, recognizes the look in their eyes that has seen the geometry of the world shift. They are accountants and teachers, nurses and mechanics. They are you under different stars. And they have stories that cling to the skin long after the telling is done. We will journey to a secluded ranch where trust was the most dangerous thing to offer. We will stand in a crowded, noisy bar and feel the ice of a silent, staring couple. We will vanish into the deep, cathedral silence of mountains where the trees hide more than wildlife. We will answer a distress signal from across a dark lake and find a waiting machine instead of a person. We will watch the house next door, where the parties are recordings and the truth is buried under the smell of bleach. We will inherit a family home and, with it, a punctual haunting that arrives at 1:17 a.m. We will lock ourselves in and still hear the footsteps in the hall. And finally, we will listen in on a telephone line that should be dead, carrying messages from the other side of a line we were never meant to cross. These are their stories. Listen closely. The next whisper might have your name. The advertisement was simple, almost charming in its rustic need. Responsible sitter wanted for 2 beloved border collies, Blue and Sage, for 1 week. Quiet, rural property. Generous daily rate. For Maya, it was a lifeline. New to the faded farm town of Mills End, her savings were evaporating. The introvert's curse, a friendly face but no deep connections, left her options thin. Her one acquaintance, a warm-hearted waitress named Laura, had sent her the link. The Adlers are a bit particular, Laura had said, stirring a lemon wedge into her iced tea. But they pay on time and the dogs are sweethearts. Could be a good fit. The Adler property was a 10-minute drive from the town's last stoplight, down a gravel road that whispered under the tires. The house was a monument to the 1970s. Low-slung brick, a roof of weathered cedar shakes, windows small and secretive. It wasn't abandoned, but it wore an air of profound fatigue. The front garden was a tangle of rose bushes gone wild, their thorns clutching at the air. Carl and Deborah Adler met her at the door. He was tall, with a mechanic's hands, broad and permanently lined with grease. She was slight, her smile not in her eyes but carefully positioned on her lips. They were, Maya thought, in that indeterminate zone between late 40s and early 60s that hard living carves into a person. "Welcome," Deborah said, her voice a dry leaf of a sound. "We appreciate you coming all the way out." The tour was methodical and deeply odd. They spoke in minimal, functional sentences. Kitchen. The door would open. Maya would peer in. It would close. Living room. Open. Peek. Close. It felt less like a tour and more like an inventory being verified. The dogs, however, were a burst of pure joy, 2 balls of black and white fur and frantic wagging tails. She knelt, and they covered her face in licks, a moment of normalcy. It was the cameras she couldn't reconcile. They were everywhere. A discreet dome in the corner of each hallway ceiling. A small, dark eye overlooking the kitchen table. One aimed directly at the back door, another covering the long, lonely driveway. "The business," Carl grunted when he saw her looking. He explained their side venture. A licensed trade in antique firearms and historical replicas, conducted right from a fortified workshop in the basement. The cameras were for insurance, for security. The logic was sound. The feeling was not. But need overrides unease. Maya accepted the key, a heavy brass skeleton key, and the Adlers departed the next morning in an old, muted sedan. The first 24 hours were peaceful. She worked from the cluttered office, the multi-screen monitor displaying 4 serene quadrants of empty driveway, still backyard, silent front porch, and vacant living room. It was oddly comforting, a panopticon of safety. Blue and Sage snoozed at her feet. The house, for all its oddities, was just a house. The first anomaly was small. On the second night, as a late summer storm muttered on the horizon, the quadrant showing the driveway pixelated, danced, and went black. Signal lost. Rural internet. She shrugged. But the dogs, who had been asleep, both lifted their heads as one. A low growl started deep in Sage's chest. Then they were up, a scramble of claws on hardwood, blasting through their doggy door into the night, barking in a frantic, sharp staccato. Her heart, a timid creature, began to thump against her ribs. She approached the back door, flicking on the porch light. The yard was a pool of ink beyond the weak yellow circle. The dogs were at the far fence, hackles raised, barking incessantly into the wall of black pines that bordered the property. She saw nothing. No eyes gleamed back. Calling them was useless against the tide of their alarm. Finally, she rattled the treat jar. The barking stopped. 2 shapes materialized from the dark, trotting back, tense but compliant. Once inside, she dragged a heavy, upholstered armchair from the living room and shoved it firmly against the plastic flap of the dog door. A barrier. Satisfied, she went to bed, the image of the silent, watching woods etched behind her eyelids. The next morning, disoriented by a late night, she rushed to her laptop for a work call. It was only after the call, her mouth dry and coffeeless, that she noticed the silence. No jingle of tags, no pattering of paws. The house held its breath. Blue? Sage? Nothing. A cold wire threaded through her veins. She walked to the back door. The dogs were in the middle of the yard, sniffing at a patch of clover as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. Relief, warm and sweet, flooded her. She laughed at her own nerves, and then the logic of it hit her, a physical blow to the diaphragm. The chair. She turned her head slowly, against the sudden stiffness in her neck. The heavy armchair was not against the dog door. It sat neatly, squared to the wall in the far corner of the room, 5 feet away, a distance no dog could manage, not without a sound she would have heard. Panic is not a scream. It is a vacuum. It sucked the air, the sound, the warmth from the room. Her hands trembled as she called Laura. "I need you to come. Right now. I can't. I need a second person. Something's wrong." Laura arrived, a bastion of practical denim and concern. Together, they conducted a search that felt both terrifying and absurd. They opened every closet, looked under every bed, behind every shower curtain. They found dust, old National Geographic magazines, and a profound, unsettling emptiness. "You must not have pushed it all the way," Laura soothed, her own eyes darting to the shadows. "It slid. These floors are uneven." Maya wanted to believe her. She chose to believe her. She took a picture of the reblocked door, a digital totem against the irrational. The next 4 days passed in a state of hypervigilant exhaustion. Every creak was a footstep. Every sigh of the wind was a breath at the window. She slept with a kitchen knife on the nightstand, its cool handle a pathetic comfort. The cameras flickered back online. Then, on the 5th night, they all died at once. All 4 feeds. Black. Signal lost. Signal lost. Signal lost. Signal lost. A coincidence of technology in the boonies was plausible. A synchronized failure felt intentional. She texted the Adlers, "Hey, just a heads up. All your exterior cameras seem to be offline. Want me to try resetting the router?" The message showed delivered. No reply. The silence from Florida was a weight. That night, she tried to lose herself in the blue glow of a television sitcom. The laugh track a jarring counterpoint to the void around her. Then the dogs again. The same sudden, synchronized alert. The same frantic scramble to the doggy door, blocked by the chair. Their barks were ferocious, aimed at the same spot in the woods. Before she could move, a heavy, solid thump shook the wall from the direction of the back room, the one that housed the interior door to the garage. It was the sound of something substantial meeting drywall, not the house settling. An impact. Her body went rigid. The laugh track from the TV mocked her. She muted it. Silence, thick and velvety, poured back in. And in that silence, she felt it. A presence. Not a temperature change, not a smell. A distortion in the atmosphere of the home, as if a new piece of furniture, one that absorbed sound and light, had been placed in the next room. Her phone buzzed on the couch beside her, lighting up her pale face in the dark. A text from Deborah Adler. "Don't worry about the cameras. You're safe." The words were bile in her throat. She hadn't expressed worry about her safety. She'd mentioned a technical fault. Why would that be the assumption? As her fingers hovered to reply, a second message arrived. "Also, can you check if I left the interior garage door unlocked? I don't want anything getting in." The back room. The thump had come from the back room. The room with the garage door. A primal part of her brain, the part that predates language, shrieked no. This was wrong. This was a tripwire. She didn't reply. She pretended to be asleep. 2 minutes later, her phone lit up again. "Hi, I know it's late. Can you please check this for me? I'm worried." The politeness was a claw. The insistence a shove. With a leaden dread, she picked up the knife. She walked on numb feet to the hallway leading to the back room. The door was closed. She heard a soft shuffle from within. She stopped, breath held. Her phone buzzed in her hand, Deborah's name on the screen. "I see you're up. Can you please go in and check?" The cameras. The inside cameras. The ones in the hall, the living room. They weren't offline. They were the eyes, and Deborah was on the other end, watching her hesitation play out on a screen. This was a command performance. Tears of terror and fury blurred her vision. Reluctance turned to a cold, survivalist clarity. If she didn't go in, what would they do? What was the next move in the script? Slowly, she unlocked the door, pushed it open, standing as far back in the hallway as her arm would allow, using the door itself as a shield. The room was a cave of shadows. The garage door was a darker rectangle within it. It was open a crack. She took 1 step, then 2 into the room, her arm outstretched, the knife point forward. She was 2 paces from the doorway when a notification banner, a weather alert, flashed across her phone screen. The sudden burst of light was a tiny, localized sun. It illuminated the immediate world in a stark, bluish wash. There, pressed flat against the wall right beside the garage door, was the outline of a man's forearm, from elbow to clenched fist. Fabric of a jacket. The tense curve of muscle. Time didn't slow. It shattered. She spun, a wordless cry ripping from her throat. She didn't remember running down the hall, grabbing her keys from the kitchen counter, fumbling with the deadbolt. As she flung the front door open, she heard a deep, mechanical rumble from the side of the house. The main garage door was rolling upward. Her car was pointed toward the road. She threw herself inside, key finding ignition, engine roaring to life. She slammed it into reverse, her headlights sweeping across the front of the house as she twisted to look behind her. The rising garage door had reached halfway, and in the cavernous, dark space within, illuminated in the stark white of her headlights, was a man. A grown man in a dark jacket, crouched behind a stack of storage tubs, right beside the now fully open interior door. He was frozen in the light, a rabbit in a spotlight, his face a pale oval of surprise. She didn't stop. Gravel sprayed. The car fishtailed onto the main road. She drove, sobbing, shaking so violently she feared she'd lose control, to the county sheriff's office 20 miles away. The deputies were polite, skeptical. A unit was dispatched. She sat in the harsh fluorescent waiting area, her mind replaying the forearm, the crouching man, the text. "I see you're up." The officer returned. "Ma'am, we did a thorough search. The garage door was open, like you said, but the house is clear. No signs of forced entry. No one in the woods. The dogs are fine." His tone was the verbal equivalent of a pat on the head. "Probably a vagrant saw the open door, got spooked and ran. You did the right thing calling us." They offered to follow her back, to do a walkthrough with her, to prove it was empty, to reclaim her sanity. Numb, she agreed. The house was indeed empty. Just a quiet, slightly shabby building. The chair was still against the dog door. The cameras were still dark. The officers left with reassuring nods. She sat on the couch, the knife back in her hand, the dogs pressed against her. The adrenaline had burned out, leaving a hollow, vibrating shell. Then her phone buzzed. Disregard for the frantic text she'd sent about an intruder. Coming home 4 days early. Just hours after this. "You can go now." She packed her things in 60 seconds flat. She didn't look back. As she eased her car down the long gravel drive, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The Adler house shrank, a dim hulk against the night sky. Then, from the main road, a sedan with no headlights on turned smoothly onto the gravel drive, heading toward the house. Her phone in the cup holder lit up one final time. A text from Deborah Adler. "I know." 2 words. A confirmation. A closing of the trap. They hadn't been in Florida. They had been close. They had orchestrated it all, the camera failures, the texts, the man in the garage. A test? A game? A hunt that was called off at the last moment when the police became involved? She never spoke to the Adlers again. Lara was mortified, swearing she only knew them as quiet regulars who left good tips. They stopped coming to the diner. The firearms business vanished from local online listings. Maya moved cities 6 months later. She doesn't house sit. She checks her locks not 3, but 7 times. And sometimes, in the dead of night, she wonders what the script was for the end of that performance. What was supposed to happen when she stepped fully into that garage? The answer is a void, and she pours all her gratitude into that void, thankful beyond measure that she never had to learn what waited there. The chaos of the gin mill on a Saturday night was a living, breathing entity. It was a symphony of shouted drink orders, the percussive clatter of ice and shakers, the bass thump of house music bleeding from the DJ booth, and the layered roar of 100 conversations competing for air. Leo moved through it all like a dancer in a perfectly choreographed storm. His hands were a blur. Grab the bottle of well gin, count a 4-second pour, twist the lime wedge, slide the glass across the polished bar top to a waiting hand, already turning to take the next ticket. 2 IPA, 1 old-fashioned, 3 tequila shots. He didn't need to write it down. The noise was his element, a cocoon of purposeful motion that left no room for the static of his own thoughts. The place had a weird setup, no servers, just bartenders and kitchen staff. You ordered food and soft drinks at the bar, collected them from the pass. It was a cost-cutting measure by management, but it created a relentless, high-tempo flow that Leo thrived on. He loved the brief, transactional connections, the fleeting smiles, the alchemy of turning a bad day around with a perfectly balanced cocktail. It kept the loneliness, a cold stone in his pocket since his last relationship dissolved, safely at bay. His coworker, Karen, was a veteran. She'd been slinging drinks here for 15 years and possessed a preternatural awareness of the room. She could recall a customer's usual drink from 2 years prior, notice a flicker of discomfort at a table, and had a radar for trouble before it bubbled over. They worked in efficient, silent tandem, a well-oiled machine. The crowd tonight was young, a university crowd flush with fake IDs and parental money. The tips would be mediocre, but the energy was high. He was midway through building a line of gin and tonics when a shift in the light, a subtle opening in the human mass, caught his eye. An elderly couple had settled into the high-backed corner booth, the one partially obscured by a structural pillar. It was an odd sight, but not alarming. Maybe they were waiting for grandkids, or were hopelessly lost on their way to a quieter bistro. The man wore a crisp, anachronistic flat cap and a brown tweed jacket. The woman's silver hair was set in neat, rigid waves, and her dress was a muted floral print. They sat perfectly upright, not touching, their hands folded on the table before them. Leo filed them away as a curiosity and returned to the storm of orders. 30 minutes and 100 drinks later, his gaze swept the room again. A bartender's inventory check. The couple hadn't moved. Not a fraction. They hadn't procured menus. They certainly didn't have drinks. In the swirling vortex of the bar, they were a still point, a statue garden of two. A minor itch of professional concern nudged him. Maybe they were confused by the system. When a lull finally presented itself, a precious 30 seconds where no hand was waving, no voice calling, Leo grabbed 2 menus and a cocktail list. "Be right back," he muttered to Karen, who nodded without looking up from her pour. As he approached, the strangeness intensified. They weren't looking at each other. They weren't looking at the vibrant crowd. Both pairs of eyes were fixed on the blank, burgundy-painted wall beside their booth, not gazing absently, but with a focused, unwavering attention, as if studying a masterpiece the rest of the world couldn't see. "Evening, folks," Leo said, his professional cheer feeling brittle. "Can I start you off with something to drink? Our cocktail list is here, food menus on the other side." He placed the laminated cards on the table between them. Neither looked at the menus. Neither looked at him. The woman's profile was porcelain still. The man's did not twitch. Leo cleared his throat, the sound swallowed by the music. "Everything okay over here?" Slowly, with a stiffness that seemed mechanical, the man turned his head. It wasn't the fluid motion of a person responding to a voice. It was the deliberate, axis-turning rotation of a surveillance camera. His face came into the dim overhead light. Leo's smile froze. The man's skin was the color and texture of old parchment, stretched taut over pronounced cheekbones. Deep fissures, more like cracks than wrinkles, mapped his face. But it was the eyes that stopped Leo's breath. They were a pale, milky blue, sunken so deep in their sockets they seemed like holes punched into a paper mask. There was no spark of life, no curiosity, no social acknowledgement. Just a vast, dry emptiness. The man's lips, thin and bloodless, did not part. He simply shook his head once. A single, decisive, silent negation. The movement was final. The conversation was over. A cold finger traced a path down Leo's spine, a sensation so visceral it overrode the bar's heat. The sheer wrongness of the stare was an assault. It wasn't hostile, not in any recognizable way. It was null. It was the absence where a human response should be. "Right, well, I'll give you a minute," Leo stammered, backing away. He felt those empty eyes track his retreat all the way to the bar. For the next hour, he threw himself into work with frantic intensity, avoiding that corner of the room. But his peripheral vision, honed by the job, kept betraying him. Every time he glanced over, they were in the same position. Statues. Waiting. For what? During another brief respite, he nudged Karen. "Hey, the older couple in the corner booth. You see them?" Karen followed his subtle nod, her eyes scanning the booth. She looked back at him, a faint frown line appearing between her brows. "What older couple?" "The ones right there. Tweed jacket, floral dress. Sitting bolt upright." Karen looked again, longer this time, her head tilted. She shook her head. "Leo, there's no one in that booth. Hasn't been all night. You feeling okay?" Her tone was light, but her eyes held a flicker of genuine concern. A bolt of pure disorientation shot through him. "You're joking. Right there. Look." "I am looking," she said, her voice dropping. "It's empty." See for yourself. He turned fully. The booth was occupied. The woman was now slowly turning her head. Her own movements just as stiff and deliberate as the man's had been. Her eyes, when they found his across the crowded room, were the same deep, light-swallowing voids. And she was staring directly at him. Not at the wall. At him. His blood seemed to thicken in his veins. Karen, for God's sake. They're looking at me. She followed his horrified gaze to the empty booth, then back to his face. Her expression softened into one of gentle, professional worry. Leo, honey, you're white as a sheet. You're maybe dehydrated, or it's the strobe from the DJ lights. Go grab a water in the back. I've got the bar. He couldn't argue. The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. He saw them. Karen, with her legendary awareness, saw nothing. Which reality was true? He gulped down a pint of ice water in the stockroom, the chill doing nothing to warm the cold dread in his gut. When he returned, he kept his eyes strictly away from the corner. He couldn't bear another glimpse, another confirmation of his own potential madness. Last call came and went. The crowd thinned, then vanished, leaving a battlefield of empty glasses and sticky floors. As they wiped down and counted registers, Leo gathered his courage. Karen, seriously, earlier. You really didn't see anyone in that booth? She stopped counting ones and looked at him squarely. Leo, I've been doing this a long time. I notice everyone. The girl in the green dress who sent back her Cosmo twice. The guy in the baseball cap who tried to use an expired ID. The group of frat boys who spilt a pitcher. I didn't see an elderly couple. Not when we opened, not at peak, not now. She offered a small, sympathetic smile. Long week, maybe? Your brain can play tricks when you're tired. He forced a laugh, the sound hollow. Yeah, must be. But walking out the back door into the employee parking lot, the cool night air was no relief. The street was deserted, lit by the sickly orange glow of sodium vapor lamps. His car was the only one left. As he fumbled for his keys, his eyes lifted involuntarily across the street. There, under the single, flickering streetlight on the opposite curb, stood two figures. They were far enough away to be silhouettes, but the outlines were unmistakable. The upright posture, the hat, the shape of the woman's hair. They were standing side by side, facing the now dark facade of the gin mill. Facing him, all the sound drained from the world. The distant city hum vanished. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic prisoner. He couldn't scream. He couldn't move. He stood locked in a silent stare with those two distant, shadowy forms. Then, as if on a shared cue, they both took a single, simultaneous step forward, off the curb and into the street. That broke the spell. Leo's body unlocked in a surge of pure adrenaline. He wrenched his car door open, fell inside, and locked it with trembling fingers. He didn't look back as he screeched out of the lot. He drove for blocks, his mind a riot of panic. Had Karen lied? Was she part of it? Were they ghosts? Were they something else? Was he having a psychotic break? He never saw them again. He asked other staff casually, days later, if they remembered any unusual older patrons. No one did. The incident left no trace in the shared reality of his workplace, only in the shattered interior of his own. He started taking a different route to his car. He avoided looking at the corner booth. The loud, cheerful chaos of the bar, once his sanctuary, now felt like a mask, behind which impossibly quiet and wrong things could simply sit and watch, unseen by everyone but him. The question that haunted him wasn't, what were they? It was more terrifying. Why could I see them? It implied a flaw, a crack in his perception that aligned him with a world Karen and the others were blessedly blind to. He began to fear not the dark, but the moment his own eyes might again betray him by seeing what wasn't, or worse, what was. There for him alone, the silence of the North Cascades wasn't an absence of sound, but a presence. It was the dense, woolly quiet of centuries of fallen needles, of slow granite breaths, of air so clean and cold it felt like a substance. For Tom Harrigan, this silence was his office. Perched in the glassed-in cab of his Feller Buncher, a $800,000 mechanical beast on tank tracks, He was a god of demolition. With joystick controls, he could wrap the machine's giant steel arms around a 200-foot Douglas fir, shear it off at the base with a hydraulic roar, strip its branches, and slice it into perfect logs in under 90 seconds. He was paid by the ton, not the hour. Time was bark, and bark was money. His partner, Griffin, operated an identical machine half a mile away. Across a brutal scar of clearcut they were carving into the mountain's flank. Their communication was a crackling lifeline on Channel 4 of their Motorola radios. "Headed to the North Ridge, break for lunch in 30, Tom would say. "Copy. Found a rock shelf here, gonna pivot east," Griffin would reply. It was functional, sparse. They were 10 days into this particular contract, a brutally remote patch of federal land. The access road alone had taken the company 3 weeks to bulldoze. No cell service. The nearest town was a 2-hour bounce down a logging track. They slept in a shared, rugged camper truck parked on the landing, the bald, muddy zone where process logs were piled for transport. The first interference was easy to dismiss. A whisper of static underneath Griffin's transmission. A faint, muddy garble that could have been a distant CB radio from a highway dozens of miles away, bouncing through some atmospheric freak. Tom thumped the radio with a greasy glove, and it cleared. But it came back. The next day and the next. Not with Griffin's transmissions, but in the silent spaces between. A low murmur, like voices heard through a motel room wall. Indistinct but unmistakably human. The cadence of conversation, without the words. "Griff, you picking up chatter?" Tom asked one afternoon, watching a light snow begin to dust his cab windows. "Negative. Quiet as a tomb on my end." "You got company?" "Just static," Tom said, not wanting to sound spooked, but he switched the channel. From 4 to 7. The ambient forest sounds filled the cab, the distant whine of his own machine's hydraulics, the wind. 10 minutes later, beneath the wind, the murmur returned. On Channel 7, a cold knot formed in his stomach. Radios don't work like that. You can't follow a specific frequency hop. Not without sophisticated, targeted equipment. He switched to Channel 12, a rarely used company band. Silence for an hour. Then, as he was finishing a complex cut, a voice crystal clear for half a second. "Need more of the heavy rope," before dissolving back into static. He slammed the radio off. His hands were shaking. He looked out at the endless, rolling green of the untouched forest ahead of him, the darkening sky above. The solitude, once empowering, now felt like exposure. The next morning, Griffin found the first footprint. Not a boot print. A sneaker print, size small. In a patch of mud near a creek. Fresh. Then an empty can of beans. Rusted but with a label that hadn't faded to nothing. Recent. They began finding more. A crude lean-to of branches. A fire ring of stones still holding the ghost of warmth. A child's red mitten, dirty and damp. The discovery of the tent, however, turned unease into a chilling, specific fear. It was a green dome tent, camouflaged with ferns, tucked into a gully away from the logging path. Griffin called him over. The silence between them was heavy as they stood before it. The zipper was partly open. Griffin, with a stick, lifted the flap. The smell that wafted out was a mix of mildew, stale body odor, and something sweetly chemical. Inside, a single rumpled sleeping bag. A military-style duffel. Griffin, his face pale, used the stick to drag the duffel into the light. He unzipped it. Tom wished to God he hadn't seen. Piled inside were not camping supplies. There were bundles of nylon rope, a roll of heavy-duty duct tape, a packet of zip ties, and beneath that, a stack of cheap, spiral-bound notebooks. Griffin flipped one open. The pages were filled not with writing, but with drawings. Crude, stick-figure sketches of terrifying clarity. Children and adults, engaged in acts that made Tom's vision swim. He dropped the notebook as if it were on fire. Beneath the notebooks were Polaroid photos. Not of people, but of objects. A child's bicycle against a tree, a playground swing, a lunchbox on a doorstep, and in each one, placed carefully in the foreground, a fresh, shiny red apple. "We're gone," Griffin whispered, his voice tight. "Right now. We call the foreman. We get off this mountain." Tom, driven by a stubbornness born of mortgage payments and a deep, foolish pride, argued. "We walk off, we lose the contract. Maybe our jobs. It's probably some sicko who's long gone. We finish the cut, we do it together. Radio silence unless it's an emergency. We're armed at night." He indicated the rifle mounted in his cab. Griffin reluctantly agreed. The plan was one of shared, unspoken dread. They worked faster, the machines roaring in dissonant harmony, chewing through the ancient forest with a new, desperate urgency. The beauty of the woods was gone, replaced by a looming sense of being catalogued, studied. That night, in the cramped, warm camper, the radio on the table between them crackled to life. Not with static, but with a conversation. Two male voices, filtered and strange, but intelligible. Voice 1. "Caught a few trout down at the bend. Enough for supper." Voice 2. "Good. Firewood's dry. Should burn clean." Voice 1. "Think we'll have visitors again?" Voice 2. "Maybe. They're getting closer." Saw the tracks. Tom and Griffin stared at the radio, frozen. The voices were calm, conversational, domestic. They were discussing dinner, firewood, and them. The ordinariness of the tone made the content monstrous. These were the owners of the tent. They knew they were being searched for, and they were just waiting. Without thinking, Tom snatched the microphone. His fear erupted as rage. "Who is this? What do you want? This is private property. You sick fucks." The radio went dead silent. Not even static. The void left by his shout was absolute. "Are you insane?" Griffin hissed. "You just told them exactly where we are and that we know." Before they could argue further, a new sound came from outside. Not from the radio. A soft crunch on the gravel perimeter they'd arranged around the truck. A footstep. Then another. Both men stopped breathing. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling. Tom reached for the rifle, his hands fumbling in the dark. He clicked open the bolt. The chamber was empty. In his panic that afternoon, he'd unloaded it inside the cab and hadn't reloaded. The box of ammunition was... where? In the glove box of the feller buncher? He couldn't remember. The footsteps stopped right outside the camper's metal door. They heard the gentle scrape of a hand finding the door handle. The metallic click jiggle as it was tested. It was locked. A long pause. Then came the scratching. Not an animal's frantic clawing. Long, slow, deliberate drags of something metal. A knife tip, a nail down the length of the door right at eye level. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. For minutes. It lasted 4 agonizing minutes. Tom felt a warm trickle of urine down his leg. His terror so complete it bypassed his brain entirely. Griffin was praying. A silent, rapid movement of his lips. The scratching stopped. Tom, driven by a final, reckless need to see, to confront the thing shattering his world, nodded at Griffin. He pointed to the door, then to his own chest. He would look. He crept forward, a heavy maglite in his now empty hand. He placed his hand on the cold metal latch, took a shuddering breath, and yanked the door open, flashing the light out into the darkness. The door burst inward as if it had been waiting. A shape slammed into him. A searing, white-hot pain exploded across the bridge of his nose and his right eye. He was falling backward, the world tilting. He hit the camper floor hard, the breath knocked out of him. The taste of copper filled his mouth. Through a blur of agony and tears, he saw a man in dark, dirty clothing. His face a shadow under a hood, raising a long hunting knife. A weight landed on the man as Griffin launched himself from the bunk. They crashed into the small table, sending the radio smashing to the floor. Tom tried to get up, but a boot connected with the side of his head. Lights popped behind his eyes. Another man was inside, kicking him methodically, brutally. He heard a grunt, a cry of pain. Griffin's. Then the weight on his chest was gone. The kicking stopped. The two shapes disentangled and melted back out the open door, vanishing into the consuming blackness of the forest. Griffin helped him into the truck. The 2-hour drive to the county hospital was a haze of pain and shock. The damage was permanent. A shattered orbital bone, a severed optic nerve. His right eye was saved, but its pupil remained permanently dilated and off-center. A window that let in light but showed a world forever fractured and dim. The police report was a dead end. No fingerprints but theirs in the camper. The tent and its horrors were gone when a sheriff's deputy finally hiked in. The forest had swallowed the evidence and the men whole. 2 weeks later, as a replacement crew moved in to finish the job, a bulldozer operator preparing a new landing found a body in a drainage ditch. It was one of theirs, a swamper named Luis. He'd been reported missing the night before. The official report said he'd been bound, gagged, and suffered trauma consistent with a severe assault. The whispered word in the company locker room, the word that made Tom vomit when he heard it, was violated. No arrests were ever made. Tom lost his job. A man with one good eye can't operate heavy machinery. The PTSD became a cage. He couldn't bear the sound of a radio's static, jumping at every crackle. Forests, once his cathedral, were now labyrinths of hidden eyes. The company paid his medical bills and a small severance. The case grew cold, filed away in a rural county's cabinet. Tom's story lived on only in the hushed tones of his son, who shared it years later with a friend, trying to explain his father's flinch at sudden noises, his hatred of the dark, and the way he always sat with his back to the wall, his good eye scanning the room, forever on watch from a night in the mountains when the quiet itself became the hunter. The water of Willowmere Lake was a pane of smoked glass, perfectly reflecting the bruised peaches and purples of the late summer sunset. The air held the day's warmth, but beneath it was the crisp, clean promise of autumn. Kevin sat on the end of the cedar plank dock, legs dangling, a cold bottle of beer sweating in his hand. The peace was a physical weight, trying to press down the chaotic static in his mind. 3 years. 3 years with Elise. Down the drain in a single, brutal 2-hour conversation that had left him feeling gutted, hollowed out, and stupid. "You're ruminating." James's voice cut through the twilight, accompanied by the soft clink of another bottle being set down beside him. "Your face does this thing. It looks like a confused basset hound." Kevin managed a grunt. James, his oldest friend, was sprawled on a canvas deck chair, the picture of prep school ease. The lake house, a sprawling modernist structure of glass and weathered timber, was just one of several properties his family owned. For James, this was a casual weekend retreat. For Kevin, it was a lifeline, an escape from the 4 walls of his apartment that seemed to whisper Elise's name. "I'm not ruminating. I'm decompressing." By staring at the water like you're trying to summon the lady of the lake to ask for a better girlfriend? "Dude, she was a nightmare at my birthday party," she corrected the sommelier. Twice. A faint, real smile touched Kevin's lips. She was passionate about tannins. She was pretentious about wine. There's a difference. James took a long pull from his bottle. "Forget her. This is brotier healing. Sun, water, questionable dietary choices, and zero responsibility. Your only job is to not fall in and drown." It was the perfect prescription. For the first time in weeks, the tight coil in Kevin's chest began to loosen. They grilled steaks, argued about movies, and said nothing of consequence. The lake was theirs. The other cottages, multi-million-dollar architectural statements, were mostly dark, their wealthy owners back in the city. The world shrank to the soft lap of water against the dock pilings and the chorus of crickets. It was during a comfortable, beer-sated silence that Kevin saw it. A pinprick of white light, flickering from across the lake. It was there, then gone, then there again. He blinked, assuming a trick of the light, a reflection from their own house catching a window just right. "You see that?" he asked, nudging James with his foot. "See what?" "That light. Over there. By the big pine that's leaning." James squinted. For a moment, nothing. Then it came again. A deliberate flash. Then 2 more in quick succession. "Yeah. Probably someone with a flashlight." But it continued. Not random. A rhythm. Flash, flash, flash. A longer pause. Then a sustained glow that lasted a full second before cutting out. Then flash, flash, flash again. "That's weirdly regular," James murmured, sitting up. They watched, mesmerized, as the pattern repeated. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, a pause. Then again. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. A cold finger, unrelated to the evening chill, traced Kevin's spine. "That's not someone looking for their dog." James was silent for a full cycle. When he spoke, his voice had lost its lazy drawl. S.O.S. The 2 acronyms hung in the air between them, stripping away the cozy night. S.O.S. The universal distress signal. Not a greeting, not a code between friends. A scream for help rendered in light. "You're sure?" Kevin's mouth was dry. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. It's the only Morse code everyone knows. Someone's in trouble over there. All the peaceful decompression vanished, replaced by a sharp, adrenalized clarity. The scenarios flashed. A boating accident, a heart attack, a fall. Someone alone, injured, flashing a dying phone or a flashlight toward the only visible signs of life. Their own lit dock. "We have to call the cops," Kevin said, already fumbling for his phone. "And say what?" James countered. "We saw a light? They'll ask if we investigated. If we heard screams. We've been drinking, Kev. You're on probation for that DUI. You think a wellness check is a good idea for you right now?" The reminder was a splash of cold water. The legal trouble was a fresh, humiliating wound. An interaction with the police, however well-intentioned, was a minefield. "So we just ignore it?" Kevin's voice rose. "Someone could be dying. Or," James said, his eyes gleaming with a familiar, reckless light, "it's some kids playing a prank, or someone trying to lure people over. That house has been empty for years. The Carlisle place. Dad says it's stuck in inheritance hell." They argued in hushed, urgent tones. The moral imperative versus pragmatic fear. The unknown across the water was a Rorschach test of their own characters. Kevin's innate, often inconvenient empathy versus James's calculated, privileged caution. But the light kept flashing. That relentless, damning rhythm. S.O.S. 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 It was the pattern's persistence that won. A prankster would have gotten bored. A real emergency wouldn't stop. "We go," James said finally, the decision solidifying. "We take the kayak. We get close, we assess. If it's real, we use your phone to call 911 from their shore. We're just concerned citizens on a midnight paddle." It was a thin justification, but they clung to it. The plan was simple, stupid, and born of a youthful conviction that they were the heroes of this particular night. They changed into darker clothes. In James's brother's room, a shrine to teenage angst and martial arts, they found a pair of tactical flashlights and, in a locked drawer James picked with practiced ease, 2 switchblades. The weight of the knife in Kevin's pocket was alien, a sinister counterpoint to the benevolent night. The kayak was a sleek, 2-person fiberglass thing, stored under the deck. It whispered into the water with a gentle splash that sounded far too loud. The journey across the lake was a surreal transition from the known to the unknown. The lights of James's house receded, warm and golden. The darkness ahead deepened. The only sounds were the drip of their paddles and their own synchronized breathing. The flashing light had stopped. The far shore was a solid wall of black. As they drew closer, the Carlisle house emerged from the gloom. It was a grand, Victorian-style structure, all gingerbread trim and gabled roofs, but it wore its neglect like a shroud. Shutters hung askew. The wraparound porch sagged in the middle. The dock, which they'd aimed for, was a skeletal ruin, half-submerged and treacherous. "We'll beach it," James whispered, his bravado thinning. They scraped onto a narrow, rocky strip of shore. The silence here was profound. No crickets, no frogs, just the vast, watchful quiet of the empty house looming above them. Using their flashlight beams sparingly, they picked their way up the overgrown bank. Every snap twig was a cannon shot. The back of the house was a landscape of decay. A rusted swing set stood sentinel in the tall grass. A window on the first floor was not just cracked, but missing its pain entirely, a dark mouth waiting. "This is a profoundly bad idea," Kevin breathed, his hand closing around the knife in his pocket. "We're already committed," James replied, but his voice was tight. He approached the window, shone his light inside. The beam swept across a bare, dusty floor, stripped of all furniture. Empty. Totally empty. That should have been the final red flag. A furnished house might suggest an occupant. A stripped one screamed abandonment. But the memory of the flashing S.O.S, coming from an upstairs window of this very house, pushed them forward. They had to know. Kevin boosted James through the window, then scrambled in after him. The interior was a cathedral of nothing. Their footsteps echoed in the void. No rugs, no curtains, no light fixtures. Just bare floorboards and walls scabbed with faded wallpaper. They moved like ghosts through the spectral rooms, their flashlight beams slicing the dust-heavy air. The stairs creaked a protest with every step. The upper hallway was a tunnel of doors, all closed. Kevin's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He pointed to the door at the end of the hall, the one that would face the lake. The light had come from there. They paused, ears straining. Nothing. Kevin pressed his ear to the cool wood. Silence. He looked at James, who gave a tight, nervous nod. He turned the knob. The door swung open silently, on well-oiled hinges. The room was as empty as the others, except for one item. Sitting on the floor in the exact center of the room, aimed directly at the large, grimy window overlooking the lake, was an old, boxy film projector. A heavy-duty extension cord snaked from it, disappearing into a hole in the floorboards. It was an artifact from another century, yet it hummed with a faint, warm electrical smell. It made no sense. No film reel was loaded. The lens was capped. It was just a machine, sitting in an empty room, pointed at a window. Then the understanding hit them both at once. A chilling wave of comprehension. The flashes of light. The S.O.S. It wasn't a flashlight. It was the projector's bulb. Someone had programmed it or manually controlled it to flash that pattern. A lure. A mechanical anglerfish, glowing in the deep. "It's a trap," James whispered, the words barely audible. The reaction was instantaneous, primal. James whirled and sprinted for the stairs. Kevin was a half-step behind him, fear lending wings to his feet. The peaceful exploration shattered into a headlong, panicked flight. Their footsteps thundered on the bare stairs, a frantic drumroll of retreat. As they hit the bottom landing, a new sound joined the cacophony. A door slamming open upstairs. Then heavy, rapid thumps, someone running, following them down. "Go, go, go!" Kevin screamed. They crashed through the empty living room, back toward the window they'd entered. James went through first, a tumbling roll into the grass. Kevin leapt, snagging his shirt on a nail, tearing free. They scrambled down the bank toward where they'd left the kayak. It was gone. The narrow strip of shore was empty, just rocks and dark water. "No, no, and oh!" James gasped, spinning around. From the side of the house, a figure emerged. It was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a terrifying, athletic speed. It wasn't running at them. It was cutting off their escape route along the shore, hurting them. Kevin yanked the switchblade from his pocket, thumbed the release. The blade snapped out with a sharp click. He expected James to do the same. Instead, James looked at the freezing black water, then at the accelerating figure and made a choice. "Swim!" he shouted. And without a second's hesitation, he plunged into the lake. For a fractured second, Kevin stood paralyzed, the knife held out in a pathetic gesture of defiance. The figure was 30 yards away and closing fast. The water was a black, unknown terror. But the man approaching was a solid, immediate one. He dropped the knife, clattered on the rocks. He turned and jumped. The cold was a physical assault. It stole his breath, clamped around his lungs like iron bands. He surfaced, gasping, and began to swim with a frantic, graceless stroke. James was ahead, a dark head bobbing in the water. Behind, he heard a splash. The man had reached the shore. Was he coming in after them? Kevin didn't look back. He swam, arms burning, legs leaden, fueled by pure, undiluted terror. The lights of James's house seemed to mock them, not getting any closer for an eternity. He thought of the lake's depth, of things that might brush his legs, of the cold sapping his strength. He swam until his muscles screamed and his vision spotted. When his knees finally scraped the muddy bottom of their own shore, he crawled more than walked onto the land. He and James lay on the dock, heaving, vomiting lake water, shivering uncontrollably. Somehow they made it inside. They locked every door, drew every curtain. Kevin's hands shook so violently he could barely dial 911. When the police arrived, skeptical and slow, they told a fragmented, hysterical story about a distress signal, an empty house, a projector, and a chase. The officers exchanged a look. They took a patrol boat across the lake. Kevin and James watched from the window as flashlights moved through the dark house. An hour later, the officers returned. "House is abandoned, like we said," the older cop reported, his tone weary. "No signs of forced entry. No footprints in the dust upstairs that we could see. No projector." He fixed them with a stern gaze. "You boys know it's illegal to trespass? And were you drinking tonight?" It was the ultimate gaslighting. The evidence had vanished. Their story sounded like the paranoid fantasy of two drunk kids. They were chastised, their information logged with obvious dismissal. James's parents were livid. Kevin was told, in politely icy terms, that he was no longer welcome. The friendship, strained by the shared trauma and the ensuing blame, never fully recovered. Kevin never got answers. Was the projector real? Who was the man? Was it a kidnapper, a murderer, a deranged squatter playing a sick game? The official narrative was that they'd imagined it, spooked themselves in the dark. But Kevin knew. He knew the feel of the knife in his hand, the sound of the footsteps on the stairs above them, the shape of the man emerging from the shadows. He had been the mouse in the maze, and someone had been waiting to see what the mouse would do. The most haunting question was never who or why. It was what next? What was the final act of that play? The one they'd narrowly escaped by choosing the freezing, endless dark of the lake. The answer lived in his nightmares, where he always hesitated a second too long, looks back, and sees the man's face, smiling, as he reaches the shore.